Hello everyone and welcome to Blue Collar DM. My name is Howard and today's episode is going to be all about dungeon mastering your first ever Dungeons & Dragons session and all the free resources that are out there in order to help you and your players play that first session together. Let's get to it. Alright, so you're going to be the dungeon master for your group, but you have no idea what you're doing and you have none of the books and you have to figure out a session for next week and you don't know what you're going to do. Well, that's where this comes in, and that's a good thing you're watching this video because there are plenty of free resources out there for you. One of the biggest ones that I would recommend is actually looking at the standard rules document, which I'll leave a link down in the description below on the Wizards of the Coast website. There they actually give you just a standard basic rule of thumb rules in order to be able to get through your first session with your group. And it's actually really nice because the fact of the matter is there is no barrier to actually playing this game. You don't need to have any of the books. You don't need to have any experience being a DM. The nice thing is that there's already a set of rules and it's already laid out for you and they're free to access on the website. Now, obviously the books are great because they do add some more to the game. They add a few different wrinkles and some settings and some other things, but the great thing about this game is there is no barrier to play. In the standard rules document, there's actually 4 parts. So the first is actually character creation, which we kind of talked about in another video, and I'll leave a link to that video at the end. There's actually 3 more parts that I'm actually going to go over in detail in other videos, but for a general background, they are, the rules of playing the game and, how combat works and how skills checks works and exploration and how that whole thing goes. But there's a great amount of description of it in that basic rules document, which is free to access to you. There's also the rules of magic and how magic is used in the game and how it impacts, whether it be combat, whether it impacts role-playing situations, whether it impacts skill check situations. Magic plays a big role, obviously, in the world of Dungeons & Dragons. So it's important to have a good understanding of how spells are cast and casting times and what components are and that kind of thing. But like I said, there'll be another video on that in another video. But for the time being, having access to that standard rules document and having an understanding of basic magic rules is going to be important for you. And then the last thing is actually probably one of the biggest ones for you as a first-time dungeon master is the DM tools section. And basically what those are is just different explanations on how to prepare for a session, what you should be expecting as far as what kind of build out to a session should be, the rhythm that it should have, and a basic guide to how to build encounters. It's a really helpful tool, and in all honesty, the standard rules document is very, very helpful for a first timer. And so my recommendation is to download it. You don't need to actually read the whole thing word for word, luckily. As long as you take out the bits and pieces that you need and you follow along with this video to have a general idea of what you're going to do in your first session, you should be okay. In addition to the basic rules document, the other thing that you can actually get from the Wizards website, and I can leave another link down here in the description, is actually pre-generated character sheets. So if you're a first-time dungeon master and you're just doing this on a random Saturday with your friends and your friends aren't completely as invested as you are and they want to, just give the game a little bit of a feel and test out, but don't really want to make their own character, there's actually pre-generated and pre-filled out character sheets available online on the Wizards of the Coast website, which is great because, again, the barrier to play is 0. So then, your player characters don't really have the great excuse of oh, well, I don't want to have to fill this out and figure out all the math and how to make this all work. The sheets are already made up and they can use. And so these pre-filled character sheets are also laid out and built out into 4 different subcategories. So if your player character wants to play a warrior, there's actually a warriors section where there's actually choices for fighters, barbarians, and monks as their character classes. There's another subsection for scoundrels, which in the way that the Wizards of the Coast categorizes these classes are actually the rogues, the bards, and the rangers. There's mages as well. So if your player characters want to play a magic user, there's the option to play a sorcerer, a wizard, a druid, or a warlock. And then if your characters want to play a healer, there's obviously the options to either play a cleric or play a paladin, which is really great because it also divides up these character sheets into built-out roles. So if you have a party of 4 characters, have each one pick one of the characters from each of the categories. Or don't. Doesn't matter at the end of the day. As long as your players are having fun, and as long as the barrier is minimal in order to get them to sit down at the table and give this game a shot, then have them pick whatever they want and just roll with it and try to figure it out. It's the best part about this game is the fact that there is no set path for everything, and you have to kind of make things up on the fly, which is kind of fun. All right, so now that you have a basic understanding of the standard rules document and your players have characters that they can play, now what? Well, some people think that one of the things that they need is actually to have all these fancy materials in order to play the game, but you actually don't. At the end of the day, all you really need is dice, which aren't too hard to access, and the cost of that is very minimal. But then the rest of it is just your imagination. Now, there are resources out there that you can use in order to create grid tiles, and you can get these sheets that have grids on them and grid paper, and you can play with miniatures and stuff like that. But in order to play your first session, you don't need any of that. In fact, all you really need is a pencil, piece of paper, some dice, and your brain. You can actually play everything in the theater of the mind, which, if you're not familiar with that is, it's just basically the imagination of what's happening out on the battlefield, if it's a battle, or the RP moments that are happening in the game. So, thanks to this theater of the mind play style, we're ready to go. There's no more barriers. We have our character sheets, we have a basic understanding of the standard rules, and we have our battlefield up in our brain now. So the next part is what are you going to do? What is the session going to be about? That's what the next part of this video is going to talk about. In general, what you want to do is have a basic breakdown of what's going to happen, and to kind of give you kind of a more logistical way to break it down, you want to have some sort of an introduction to your session where you introduce the characters to what's going on. You want to have a call to action along with 2 to 3 encounters. Now, depending on how long you want your session to go, you can either make more encounters or you can make less. And then you want to wrap the session with some sort of conclusion, especially in this first session, because you want it to be kind of special for your players. For a good example on how to introduce your session, you want to start out somewhere that is going to be in a place where all the characters kind of already know each other. Now, the players can either play themselves in the game as whatever character sheet that they're portraying, or they can come up with some sort of character idea in their back of their mind. But at the end of the day, you want to make sure that everyone knows who each other are, and you want to put them in a situation where they're already together. So a good example of this would be a tavern is a good place. And I know that's a very, very stereotypical place to start for a lot of our veteran players out there, but that's not what this video is for. This video is just for people who are just starting out. So the biggest reason why you want to start in a tavern or some sort of encampment where everyone knows each other is because it'll allow them to interact with each other, describe their characters, and this kind of process of feeling out the game and starting with role playing is going to take about 5 to 10 minutes. Now, if your players are a little bit more reluctant to start engaging in the role playing aspects and communicating with each other, you can throw in an NPC or two into that area or that space in order to interact with. A good example is maybe there's a wizard's apprentice who's sitting at the table next to them and has a story to tell of the wizard that they work for in the tower not too far by. Or maybe there's a studious scholar sitting by herself and she's a little bit nervous and jumpy, and when the players interact with her, she gets very startled. Or the bartender at the tavern is a good one to start at, who might have some rumors for the players to check out later on if they decide to continue with this adventure. Again, this part of the session will probably take about 5 to 10 minutes or longer, depending on how your players want to interact with the space, if they're really engaged. If not, then kind of push the envelope and go to the next part, which is going to be your call to action. Now, your call to action is going to be some sort of major event that's going to provide some urgency to the players during this session. Now, the reason we want to do this is because we do want to engage the players and give them kind of a good taste of what's going on in their first session ever as a Dungeons & Dragons character. So we're going to try and elicit something that's going to make them want to go do something. Now, if it's in the case of a tavern, one thing we could do is we can have maybe some goblins have kidnapped the blacksmith's daughter, and maybe the blacksmith or the mother of the daughter comes in frantic and manic and is asking for someone to help. And this is kind of a good way to prompt the players to kind of engage in what's going on, and it provides some urgency because they want to actually go out and take care of this issue. Or maybe some bandits stole something from the encampment or something like that they're at, and they got to go find them and hunt them down and get back the thing that they were holding on to, whether it be maybe they were tasked to bring an artifact to some village up the road, and now these bandits have taken it and they got to get it back or else they won't get paid. As long as there's something that can give the players something to engage with and have some urgency, that call to action will get them to do something about it and move, which is what we want to do in this situation. So the next thing we said was 2 to 3 encounters. Now these encounters don't necessarily have to be combat. They can actually be skill encounters or role-playing encounters. So a good example of a good skill-based encounter would be searching for clues to figure out where these goblins took the blacksmith's daughter, or maybe we're looking where the artifact was being stored, looking at the surrounding area and see if there's any footprints or anything like that leading somewhere else into the woods. The biggest thing here is that we're looking to engage the players in something that's going to take maybe about 5 to 10 minutes to figure out and suss out the clues in order to figure out where they need to go. But then that'll lead them to the next part of the encounter. And because there's urgency, because of that call to action, they're going to want to move very quickly. So it'll take maybe about 5 to 10 minutes to figure this part of the session out. But once they do, it'll be rewarding because they'll feel like they have some direction on where to go. And if the players do struggle in this part, you can actually kind of push them and give them some suggestions. Like, based on your character's background, do you think that it would be a good idea to go ahead and search into this pile of bags and backpacks? Yes or no? And then see if the players engage with that. The biggest thing is that we're trying to give the players some agency in order to kind of drive where the story goes next. And it may go in a really random different direction, but luckily we have an idea of like what we're structuring here so that we can build out what we're going to do next. So the next encounter we want to do is actually kind of like an exploration encounter. And what I mean by that is that we're looking to engage the players in some sort of, again, it'll be skill-based, but we want to kind of push them in the direction where they have to do something in order to either avoid maybe a combat encounter or engage in one. But the idea is that they explore and find the direction that they're supposed to be going because they actually find something on the road. And a good example of this would be maybe there's some goblins or bandits running scouting rotations, and that's going to point us in the direction, hey, we're going the right way because we're running into more of these guys, but do we necessarily want to engage with them and alert everyone else? Or do we want to try and sneak around them? Or do we want to wait for them to go by? There's a lot of different ways the players can interact with this particular encounter, which is great. Now, if they want to go ahead and attack, that's fine. I'm not going to discourage that, and neither should you. But at the same time, like, maybe make some consequences. Maybe we do something a little bit different later on, and I'll explain what happens in that little later on part at the end. Now for the third encounter, we're going to be talking about a combat encounter. Now, we might have already had a combat encounter in that second one in the exploration stage, but the idea here is that second encounter affects what happens in this third encounter. So, for example, if the goblins or the bandits are alerted and we attack those guys that were on patrol and they alert, whether it be via a horn or some sort of signal, then when we get to that third final encounter where there's more bandits or maybe there's more goblins, they'll be alert to what's happening and they'll expect the players. Where if players were able to sneak around that encounter or avoid that encounter altogether in the first place, then maybe when we get to this third encounter, the goblins aren't expecting them or the bandits aren't expecting them, and then the players have a little bit of an upper hand on the first combat that happens in the session, or maybe this is the third combat, depending on how everything's gone. So the important thing is to have that kind of big climactic kind of area where that third encounter is basically kind of the penultimate encounter of the session. So the way that we do this is that we actually want to see if we can't break this up into a couple different parts. This is easily accomplished by breaking the encounter into two pieces. So we're going to have one big encounter with multiple goblin enemies or multiple bandits who are kind of just little fledgling ones. Like maybe we have 3 or 4, depending on how big our group is. You kind of want the players to still outnumber these guys because you do want them to get to the final boss encounter of the session, because we don't want to get stuck at this first part and then not be able to get to the end where there's that big reward at the end. That's the whole entire purpose of this session, is to try to draw these players to come back. So we fight these 2 or 3 guys, and let's say that the players defeat them because there's 4 guys in the party or 4 players in the party, and we're fighting against 2 or 3 goblins. Then we're good, and that it's taken care of. Now, there's also still some ways that we can kind of change and flavor this so it's not just 2 or 3. Now, that's up to you. But one thing you can do is maybe those scouts that we snuck by sneak behind the party, if it's one of those situations where the party kind of wipes those 2 or 3 goblins in that room really quickly, and you need to kind of spice it up a little bit and give them a little bit of a, give them a little bit more sense of urgency on what's going on, or give them a little sense of danger. which is something you can do. Now, if it takes a while, and it takes a while to get through these 2 or 3 goblins or bandits or whatever, then maybe we just end it there. And that's, those 2 or 3 goblins are defeated. Those ones that were scouting don't come in. They never notice that we're there, and we're fine. After this, we want to send the player characters in further deep into whatever structure this is, whether it be a house or whether it be a cave or whatever the case may be, to go and find their target, whether it be the artifact that they're looking for, or maybe it's the blacksmith's daughter that they're trying to save. On the way to that room, we actually want to see if we can't actually trip the players up a little bit. And what I mean by that is, like, we want to set a trap. Now, the players can still find this trap with a successful perception check, and maybe we make that difficulty class of that perception check a 10. So if a player rolls a perception and they get above 10, then they see the trap and they can avoid it or disarm it. But the idea being that we want to give the players an idea that this role is dangerous, and it's not necessarily something you just like roll right through, because we want to give them a little bit more to engage with than just like fighting, talking, and that's it. You know what I mean? We want to actually make the players kind of have to think their way around the situation in order to be able to like kind of own what's going on and be like, to have some sense of accomplishment at the end. So if we put that little trip up in the middle there, maybe it's just a trip rope that, causes an arrow to fly out of a wall or something like that. Or in the case of our goblins, maybe they've rigged some logs to fall when the players walk through a tripwire that they don't see, or they step on a pressure plate that the players don't see or something like that, and then that causes the logs to fall. No, we don't want to do a ton of damage if the players don't see this and they fail their ability to get out of the way of this, but just something to kind of give the players some sense of like, oh no, there's more than going on than just like enemies to kill. There's things in the environment that we have to deal with. And then finally we get to the boss encounter. So in this scenario, we want to give the players something else that's a little bit more difficult. Now, if you're doing the goblin encounter that we talked about before, there's actually a goblin boss character that you can actually utilize in the monster manual, or I believe it's also in the standard rules document as well. Or you can just soup up a goblin to have more HP that's harder to kill, and maybe instead of doing 1d6 damage, it does 1d8 damage when it hits something, just to make this goblin be a little bit more special than the other ones and make him kind of a bigger deal than the rest of them. But then have him have like one minion that's maybe, a regular goblin with half the amount of HP that does a little bit less damage, just to kind of have like more than one thing to kind of focus on. Because if your players are going to 4-on-1 one monster, that monster's probably going to go down in one round of combat. But if you have a little bit more going on, then it's going to work out better. And then the other thing you can do is you can actually put a little bit of a sense of urgency on it. Maybe that goblin minion's doing some sort of ritual on the blacksmith's daughter, or maybe that bandit is trying to like destroy the artifact that they stole because they see that you're coming and they don't want to get traced that it's them that took it. If that's the case, then obviously there's going to be some focus on, hey, we got to stop this guy, but we also have to beat this boss, because this boss is very dangerous. So it creates a little bit more tension, which is what we want, but then the reward after defeating these foes is even more rewarding. Now, depending on how the session's going, you can shorten or lengthen what's going on. Maybe you give some of the goblins more HP if the session's going a little bit faster. But hopefully at the end of this, we're about at that 1.5 to 2 hour mark, because we don't want this to take 4 hours. Especially in your first session, we don't want to see you have to kind of organize and orchestrate 4 hours of content that's going on throughout an entire campaign day, because it's just going to be really, really difficult to do, especially as a first timer. If you want to go ahead and do that, go right ahead. If you want to dive head first, go right ahead. But if you're nervous about your first session and you want to try something, the hope of this kind of like outline that I've given you is that it'll take 1.5 to 2 hours to kind of get to the end of it, which is kind of good, because you also don't want your players to get too fatigued the first time they play mentally, because they're learning a new rule set. You're probably going to have to stop a couple times to look up some specific rules with combat, or some weird thing might happen and you'll need to look that up, which is fine. It's perfectly fine. Even veteran dungeon masters still look up rules in the player's handbook or the dungeon master's guide as needed whenever they're playing. So depending on how the session's going, if it's going really fast because the players are kind of sweeping right through things and they're doing a really good job, then you can kind of like slow things down by adding that extra goblin in that first encounter before the boss, or maybe you give the boss a little bit more HP than you originally planned on, just to kind of make it so that that goblin NPC lasts a little bit longer. And then at the end of that 1.5 to 2 hour mark, now we get to reward the players, which is the best part. So the reward for the players can be a couple things. So depending on where the players go, if they're following the goblins and they're trying to stop them from doing this ritual on the blacksmith's daughter, obviously they recover the blacksmith's daughter. You can hand wave the travel back to town to return the daughter, and then maybe the blacksmith gives the players a gold reward, or maybe even a fancy weapon like a +1 longsword or something like that for their efforts, because it is the local blacksmith. They should be good at making good weapons, and maybe this is kind of the like family's passed down from generation to generation weapon as a way of saying thank you to the party. And a +1 weapon isn't something to scoff at. It's actually a very valuable weapon, especially at level 1, which our players will be in this part of the game. If it's the bandits, maybe after they recover the artifact, maybe it's because they took it back to their hideout, and at the bandits' hideout they can find a number of other different treasures or gold, or maybe a +1 weapon, maybe a +1 piece of armor, or some other weirdly cool magic item that you can find in the basic rules document that is going to be fun for the players to interact with maybe the next session if they decide to continue this, or if they decide to, change it up. Maybe that becomes a device or a plot device for the session for the other characters if they want to continue to play and make their own characters. But at the end of the session and at the end of the day, what you want to do is give the players some sense of reward and accomplishment at the end of it and feel like they got something out of it, which is what we want. We want the players, and especially in this first session, to feel very good about themselves as they leave the session. And that's all there is really to it, to playing your first Dungeons & Dragons session. Now, like I said, it'll probably take you 1.5 to 2 hours, which if you can't commit to that amount of time, then there are different ways that you can shorten it, like we talked about a little bit. Maybe you take one of those encounters out. Maybe we don't have the search for clues. Maybe we just automatically find the trail to wherever we need to go in order to kind of quicken things up a little bit. But at the end of the day, it's really that simple. For more resources like the ones I talked about before, they'll be down in the description below. Again, those resources are free. If you want more resources, there are some paid ones that you can find on Amazon. But other than that, like I said, the barrier to playing this game is $0, maybe $5 for those dice. But the barrier to playing this game is very minimal, and even you can play. Till next time, see you guys soon.